Before They Were Legends. Part 2. Andrew Carnegie, the Ruthless Railroad Clerk. Do you know that one of the most celebrated philanthropists in history, a man who gave away the equivalent of over $11 billion, built his empire using insider access, strategic silence, and decisions so cold they would later cost men their lives? Before the libraries, before the peace prizes, before the image of the gentle old benefactor, there was a teenage railroad clerk, hungry, watching, learning, calculating. This is not the Andrew Carnegie you were taught about. This is the Andrew Carnegie before the legend, and once you see him, you can't unsee him. Tonight, we uncover the secret investments he made while still earning clerk wages, the mentor who quietly opened doors to power, the railroad network that became his classroom, and the moment he learned that information is more valuable than sweat. But here's the question that will follow us all the way to the end. Was Andrew Carnegie a visionary genius? Or was he America's most polished opportunist? Because the truth begins not in steel mills, but inside a telegraph office. And that's where the real story begins. Before Andrew Carnegie became the richest man in the world, before steel, before power, before philanthropy, he was a child watching his father disappear. Not physically, economically, emotionally, silently. To understand Andrew Carnegie, we must leave America. We travel to Dunfermline, 1835, a weaving town, small, proud, nigh fragile, and about to be crushed by progress. Dunfermline wasn't rich, but it had dignity. Handloom weavers worked from home, skilled hands, patient craft, threads pulled with rhythm and pride. Andrew's father, William Carnegie, was one of them. Not wealthy, but respected. And in working-class Scotland, respect was everything. Then the machines arrived, steam-powered looms, factory production, mass output, cheaper cloth, faster production, and just like that, skill became obsolete. Imagine watching your father wake up every morning, not to work, but to the slow realization that the world no longer needs what he knows how to do. Orders stop coming, income collapses, debt grows, pride shrinks. Andrew watches this. He sees the arguments, the stress, the silence at dinner. He sees something most children are shielded from: economic humiliation. And whether he understood it consciously or not, a lesson was forming. The world does not reward tradition. It rewards adaptation, or it crushes you. William Carnegie wasn't just a weaver. He was politically vocal. He believed in worker rights. He attended reform meetings, spoke about justice. But ideals do not pay rent. And as poverty tightened its grip, even belief systems begin to feel fragile. The Carnegie household becomes unstable. Andrew sees two forces collide: principle and survival. Which one wins? For young Andrew, the answer would later become clear. By 1848, the situation is unbearable. America is whispered about like a distant miracle. Opportunity, expansion, industry, hope. The family sells what little they have. They board a ship. You have 49 days at sea. Crowded, uncertain. Andrew is 12 years old enough to understand risk, young enough to absorb trauma. He leaves Scotland not as a child seeking adventure, but as a witness to collapse. And when they arrive near Pittsburgh, he sees something new: smoke, factories, movement, industry. This world is loud, relentless, hungry, and for the first time, Andrew feels possibility. His first job comes quickly: a bobbin boy in a cotton factory. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, $1.20 per week. The air is thick with lint. The machines roar endlessly. The work is repetitive, mechanical, mind-numbing. But Andrew is not mentally present in the factory. He is watching patterns. Who gets promoted? Who talks to managers? Who controls information? Even at 12, he understands something subtle. Laborers trade time. Managers trade decisions. And decisions are worth more. The boy who watched his father lose relevance is studying relevance in real time. He will never be the man whose skill becomes obsolete. Never. Around this time, something unexpected happens. A local businessman, Colonel James Anderson, opens his personal library to working boys on Saturdays, for free. Andrew devours books, history, biography, industry, strategy. He reads about men who shape systems, not men crushed by them. He begins constructing an internal blueprint. To survive, you must understand power, not just work under it, but move toward it. And then, opportunity knocks. Andrew leaves the factory. He becomes a telegraph messenger. This is no small shift. The telegraph office is the internet of the 1850s. Information flows first through these wires. Rail schedules, stock movements, corporate decisions, military updates. The men inside this room do not lift heavy machinery. They move messages, and messages move money. Andrew memorizes names, learns Morse code by ear, impresses superiors. But more importantly, he observes how information moves before the world reacts. He sees something profound. The people closest to information are rarely the ones sweating the hardest. They are the ones positioning themselves quietly. And for a boy raised in collapse, this is revelation. This is the true turning point. Not steel, not wealth, not fame. The telegraph desk. Here Andrew Carnegie internalizes 3 beliefs. First, the world changes fast. Second, those who cling to tradition lose. Third, proximity to power beats physical labor. This is no longer survival thinking. This is strategic thinking. The urgency born in Dunfermline now has direction. The boy who watched his father become obsolete is now studying how to never become obsolete. The immigrant who arrived with nothing is now inside the bloodstream of American industry. And this is where the legend truly begins. Because very soon, a railroad executive will notice him, a mentor will elevate him, and the clerk will start investing. But that is the next chapter. And when we uncover it, you'll see exactly how a hungry immigrant became a man who controlled steel, labor, and legacy. So stay with me, because the railroad clerk is about to make his first calculated move, and history will never look the same again. Telegraph offices in the 1850s were not quiet workplaces. They were not clerical rooms. They were not ordinary jobs. They were the nervous system of America. Inside these rooms, the future arrived first. Railroad movements flashed across wires. Stock transactions traveled faster than horses ever could. Government instructions moved between cities in seconds. Contracts, military logistics, corporate decisions, power itself moved through sound. Click, click, click. Streams of Morse code tapping endlessly against metal receivers. To most people, it sounded like noise. To Andrew Carnegie, it sounded like opportunity. Because for the first time in his life, he was standing where decisions were born. Most telegraph messengers ran errands. Andrew studied patterns. He memorized executives' names, learned which messages caused urgency, which ones changed schedules, which ones made powerful men nervous. Soon something remarkable happened. He stopped needing written translations. Andrew Carnegie learned to decode Morse code by ear. Operators watched in disbelief. Messages arrived, and before ink touched paper, Andrew already understood them. This made him faster, useful, valuable, but more importantly, trusted. And trust is the first doorway to power. Supervisors noticed. Managers relied on him. Executives remembered his name. And in an era when millions of immigrants remained invisible, Andrew Carnegie became visible. Every empire story has a turning point. For Carnegie, it arrived in the form of one man. Thomas A. Scott was not just another businessman. He was rising rapidly inside the most powerful corporation in America, Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad was more than transportation. It was infrastructure, influence, national expansion itself. And Thomas Scott needed someone reliable, sharp, discreet, someone who understood speed and secrecy. He chose Andrew Carnegie almost overnight. The messenger boy became Scott's personal secretary and telegraph operator, and everything changed. This promotion did more than increase Carnegie's salary. It changed his position in the hierarchy of information. Before, he delivered messages. Now, he sat beside the men creating them. He witnessed negotiations before agreements existed. He heard discussions about rail expansions months before construction began. He saw infrastructure plans the public would not learn about for years. Railroads, bridge contracts, supply agreements, investment flows. And slowly, a realization formed. The richest men were not guessing about the future. They already knew it, because they were building it. Andrew wasn't just working anymore. He was studying power at close range, watching how decisions were made, how risks were calculated, how fortunes quietly formed long before newspapers reported success. Thomas Scott didn't just employ Carnegie, he mentored him, took him into meetings, explained operations, trusted him with sensitive communication. And then, Scott introduced Andrew to something revolutionary: investment. At the time, Carnegie was still young, still technically an employee. But Scott offered him chances to buy small stakes in businesses connected to railroad expansion. Sleeping car companies, iron bridge manufacturers, supply firms tied directly to rail growth. To Andrew, this was astonishing. Workers earned wages, but executives owned outcomes. This was an entirely different game, and Carnegie entered it eagerly. Something curious began happening. Andrew Carnegie's investments performed extraordinarily well, again and again and again. Companies he invested in suddenly received railroad contracts. Bridge companies expanded right after his involvement. Transportation ventures surged in value. Timing that seemed almost perfect. Always just before public announcements. Always before markets reacted. Was Carnegie lucky? Brilliant? Or simply positioned closer to knowledge than everyone else? Remember, insider trading laws did not yet exist. Nothing he did broke rules. But access itself was power. And Carnegie understood that earlier than most men of his generation. Somewhere during these years, Andrew Carnegie grasped a principle that would define his entire life. You do not need to own the system. You need proximity to those who control it. And standing beside decision makers was more valuable than years of physical labor. Factories created workers. Information created owners. The boy from Dunfermline had solved the puzzle his father never could. Adapt before the world changes. Move toward power. Never remain replaceable. And this is the moment history rarely highlights. Andrew Carnegie stopped thinking like an employee. He began thinking like an architect, watching industries form, predicting expansion, positioning himself quietly before opportunity became visible. The railroad clerk was evolving, not through luck, not through inheritance, but through observation, access, and calculated patience. He was no longer simply working inside America's industrial revolution. He was learning how to profit from it. And soon, very soon, Andrew Carnegie would leave the railroad, not as a clerk, but as something far more dangerous, a man who understood exactly where the future was heading and how to arrive there first. And then history accelerates. America fractures. The Civil War begins. Almost overnight, railroads stop being commercial conveniences. They become weapons. Armies cannot move without trains. Food cannot reach soldiers without rail lines. Weapons cannot arrive at battlefields without logistics. Railroads become the arteries of war. And Andrew Carnegie finds himself standing at the center of it all. Working directly under his mentor, Thomas A. Scott, Carnegie helps manage military transportation for the Union. This is no longer business. This is national survival. War teaches Carnegie something universities never could: scale. Thousands of soldiers moved overnight. Bridges repaired under pressure. Rail lines rebuilt within hours after destruction. Schedules calculated with life or death consequences. One delayed shipment could mean defeat. One broken rail could cost hundreds of lives. Carnegie watches engineers race against time. He watches iron bridges replace wooden ones. He watches industry determine victory. And slowly, a realization forms in his mind. Wars are not won only by generals. They are won by infrastructure, by materials, by industry, by steel. Before the war, America ran on cotton. Agriculture dominated wealth. Plantations defined power. But Carnegie sees something others miss. Cotton burns, wood collapses, iron endures, and steel transforms nations. Railroads need stronger rails. Cities need taller structures. Bridges need durability. Industry needs permanence. Somewhere during those war years, Andrew Carnegie makes a quiet decision. The future will belong not to transportation alone, but to the material that makes transportation possible. The future is not cotton, it is steel. When the war ends, America explodes into expansion. Railroads stretch westward. Cities grow. Industry accelerates. Carnegie makes a bold move. He leaves the railroad world, not because it failed him, but because he has learned everything it could teach: information, investment, timing, systems. He carries those lessons into a new battlefield: iron manufacturing. Many businessmen entered industries hoping for profit. Carnegie enters with strategy. He already understands demand before it peaks. Railroads will need endless metal. Expansion guarantees it. Risk to him feels calculated. At first, Carnegie invests in ironworks, then bridges, then production facilities. But soon he does something radical for the time, something competitors barely understand. He refuses to depend on others. Instead, he begins controlling everything: the mines extracting raw materials, the rail lines transporting ore, the factories producing steel, the distribution networks delivering it. This strategy would later be called vertical integration. But to Carnegie, it was simple logic. If every step belongs to you, profits multiply, costs disappear, competitors struggle to survive, and slowly, his empire tightens like a closed system. Efficient, relentless, unstoppable. Inside Carnegie's operations, one rule dominates: efficiency. Machines improve constantly. Processes accelerate. Waste becomes unacceptable. Production speeds increase year after year. Steel becomes cheaper, faster to produce, harder for rivals to match. But efficiency has a human cost. Workers face longer hours, higher pressure, dangerous conditions. To Carnegie, numbers tell the story. Lower costs mean dominance. Higher output means survival. In his calculations, labor becomes an expense line, not a personal story. And this marks the true transformation. The immigrant boy shaped by poverty is now shaping an industrial machine that tolerates no weakness. By the 1880s, Andrew Carnegie controls the American steel industry. Railroads rely on him. Cities rise because of him. Bridges stand because of him. Fortunes flow toward him. He becomes one of the richest men alive. To the public, he represents success, proof of the American dream. But beneath the success, pressure builds. Because industrial empires rarely grow without resistance. And soon, that resistance explodes. The Homestead Steelworks. Workers strike. They demand fair wages, job security, respect. Management refuses. Tensions escalate. Armed guards arrive. Violence erupts. Gunfire, chaos, deaths. The nation watches in shock. The conflict becomes known as Homestead Strike. And where is Andrew Carnegie? In Scotland. Far from the violence, officially removed from decisions, but the system enforcing those decisions is his creation. Steel production eventually resumes. The company survives. The empire remains intact, but something changes. Public admiration begins mixing with doubt, and this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Andrew Carnegie once watched his own father lose dignity to industrial change. He witnessed hardship, fear, powerlessness. Yet decades later, workers in his factories faced similar fears. Long hours, economic uncertainty, industrial discipline. So history asks a difficult question. Did Andrew Carnegie escape poverty only to recreate it for others? Did survival transform into ruthlessness? Or was this simply the unavoidable cost of building modern industry? The boy who feared irrelevance had built a system where efficiency mattered more than sympathy. And yet, his legend continued to grow. Because the next chapter would change how the world remembered him forever. Not as a steel king, but as a philanthropist, a giver, a man trying, perhaps, to rewrite his legacy. So how should we really remember Andrew Carnegie? Was he a hero, a strategist, a ruthless industrialist who later rewrote his own story? Because depending on who you ask, Andrew Carnegie is either one of history's greatest success stories or one of its most carefully polished contradictions. By the time he reached the peak of power, Carnegie was no longer just a businessman. He had become an idea, the embodiment of the American dream. But behind every legend, there are competing truths, and historians still debate which version of Carnegie is real. The first interpretation is the one most people learn. Andrew Carnegie as the self-made hero, an immigrant boy arriving in America with almost nothing, working long factory hours, teaching himself through books, climbing step by step through intelligence, discipline, and relentless effort. In this version of history, Carnegie represents possibility, proof that birth does not define destiny. He recognized technological change before others, invested boldly when industries were uncertain, modernized steel production, lowered costs, helped build railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers that transformed America into an industrial power. Supporters argue something important. Steel became cheaper because of Carnegie. Infrastructure expanded faster because of him. Cities rose because his methods worked. From this perspective, Carnegie didn't exploit the Industrial Revolution. He accelerated progress itself. And progress, they argue, is never gentle. History often rewards those willing to move faster than society is comfortable with. To many admirers, Carnegie wasn't ruthless. He was necessary. But another interpretation tells a very different story. This theory begins much earlier, not with steel mills, but with a young railroad clerk. Critics argue Carnegie's rise was not purely self-made. It was strategically positioned. He worked close to powerful executives, gained early exposure to confidential information, invested in companies connected to railroad expansion before the public understood their value. He understood timing better than competitors, because he stood closer to decision-making rooms. In this interpretation, Carnegie's greatest skill was not manufacturing. It was proximity. He mastered networks, mentorship, access. He learned where opportunity would appear before others even knew to look. And once wealth began compounding, momentum carried him forward. Some historians describe him not simply as an industrial genius, but as one of the earliest masters of informational advantage. A man who understood that in modern capitalism, knowledge moves faster than labor, and those closest to knowledge win. This creates an uncomfortable middle ground, because both stories may be true. Carnegie worked hard, but he also positioned himself brilliantly. He believed in efficiency, but efficiency often hurt workers. He built opportunity, yet his empire depended on intense industrial discipline. History rarely offers simple heroes or villains. Instead, it presents people shaped by the systems they learned to survive within. And Andrew Carnegie understood capitalism earlier and perhaps more clearly than most of his generation. But then, late in life, he does something unexpected, something that changes how the world remembers him forever. In 1889, Andrew Carnegie publishes an essay that shocks both critics and admirers, The Gospel of Wealth. In it, Carnegie makes a radical argument. The wealthy, he says, should not die rich. They have a moral obligation to give their fortunes back to society, not through charity alone, but through institutions that help people improve themselves: libraries, schools, universities, cultural institutions, opportunities for education. And remarkably, Carnegie follows his own philosophy. He begins giving away vast portions of his fortune. More than 2,500 libraries funded across the world, universities established, scientific research supported, peace initiatives promoted. By the end of his life, he gives away most of his wealth. To many observers, this transforms him. The steel magnate becomes a philanthropist, a benefactor, almost a moral philosopher of capitalism. But debate never disappears. Some historians ask a difficult question. Was this generosity redemption or reputation management? Did philanthropy emerge from genuine belief or from awareness of how history might judge industrial power? Did giving away wealth cleanse earlier ruthlessness? Or did it ensure Carnegie's legacy would outshine controversy? Because today, millions remember the libraries. Far fewer remember the labor conflicts. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of Andrew Carnegie. Not how he built wealth, but how he shaped how history remembers it. So now the question passes to you. Was Andrew Carnegie a visionary who lifted society forward, an opportunist who mastered the system, or a genius who understood that legacy may be the final investment? Here's the part of the story most biographies quietly soften. The uncomfortable truth hiding behind the legend. Andrew Carnegie did not become ruthless when he owned steel mills. He did not suddenly change after becoming rich. The transformation happened much earlier, long before the fortune, long before the factories, long before the world knew his name. It happened when he was still just a clerk, inside a telegraph office, listening to messages most people never heard. That was Carnegie's real university, because there he discovered something powerful, something that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. He learned that effort alone does not control outcomes. Information does. He watched executives act before markets moved. He saw decisions made quietly, long before the public understood what was happening. And slowly, a new worldview formed. Information is leverage. Access is currency. And position beats effort. The hardest worker in the room was rarely the richest, but the best informed person often was. The railroad became Carnegie's laboratory, a living system where he studied power in motion. He observed how industries expanded, how contracts created fortunes overnight, how proximity to decision-makers opened doors invisible to everyone else. While others focused on doing their jobs well, Carnegie focused on understanding the system itself. He wasn't just working inside industry, he was learning how industry worked. And once you understand the system, you stop reacting to the future. You start positioning yourself ahead of it. This is the twist many people miss. Steel was never the beginning of Andrew Carnegie's success. Steel was the result. The outcome of lessons learned years earlier. By the time he entered the steel business, he already understood timing, already understood scale, already understood control. The empire people associate with iron and metal was actually built on knowledge, on networks, on messages moving through telegraph wires. The legend did not start in a furnace. It started with information. And maybe that changes how we see Andrew Carnegie entirely. Perhaps he wasn't simply an industrial genius. Perhaps he was one of the first modern strategists, a man who realized that the real engine of power is not labor, not even capital, but awareness. Seeing change before others see it, acting before others understand it. So the question becomes, was Carnegie building steel, or was he mastering the future itself? Because once you understand where power truly begins, legends stop looking accidental. They start looking inevitable. So now I leave it to you. Was Andrew Carnegie a visionary immigrant hero, or a master strategist who understood that morality bends around power? Does philanthropy erase exploitation, or does it simply outlive it? Comment below. I read every theory. And if you want more stories about the hidden beginnings of powerful figures, subscribe to Before They Were Legends, because next time we uncover another icon before the world called them great. And once again, you may never see history the same way.